Are we going to see an election dominated by thoughts and opinions of elites, or rather by opinions and choices made by either the redneck or the common folks?
Well, Tianwei, you've asked the key question. And there are many groups in the United States that believe in the process of globalization and that the urban population in the United States has become separated from the interests of the rest of the population in income terms or value terms and so forth. So the question really is how big is this disaffected group? That's the key issue. And how motivated are the disaffected to go to the polls versus how motivated are the, you say, elites to go to the polls? So these are all important questions. But in the end, I think, just as in China, globalization has benefited many more people than it's hurt.
We always understand from this part of the world that China is not necessarily going to be a huge topic in the US presidential election, which it shouldn't be. It should be more about what the Americans are interested in. Is China's role now in the US presidential election, has it evolved?
If you ask what really motivates people to go vote, it's going to be things like health care, social security, and so forth. China's not a major issue, but it's a very convenient, what we might call straw man. What it really, China has come to stand for is a dynamic economy that has been rising as the United States, in the minds of many in the United States, has not made the progress itself that it wishes. And therefore it's very easy, I think, to blame foreigners. I would say, with all delicacy, the people in the United States are not only the only ones who sometimes blame foreigners for their own problems.
There has been some kinds of belief in China that Mr. Trump, being a fresh face, at least in the political scene, probably is going to give a quote-unquote nice surprise once he comes into the office as President of the United States of America. On the other hand, Secretary Clinton, with very long political track record, even as Secretary of State, probably for Asia, particularly for China, people can already predict where she is going. Of course, we don't matter in your election, but people have opinions.
Right.
What do you make of these assumptions, Professor Lampton?
Well, first of all, your premier was just in the UN and spoke in New York City to a business group, and he was asked this very question, and I thought he had a very good answer. And that is to say, it's the job of the American people to elect their officials, and it's our job to deal with whatever results. So I think that's the position that I can see China's government and responsible people articulating. Now, what you're really asking me, in a way, is who will be better for the interests of the Chinese people?
Of course, it is. Electing an American president is not about the interests of China, it's more about America. But who is more likely, Professor Lampton, from your knowledge of these two people, in terms of understanding the real nature of this relationship and the necessity that the two countries really have to work together to avoid crisis?
Right. I think Mrs. Clinton, for whatever you want to say, and I think many Americans have misgivings, including me, but on balance, she has been part of a policy for over 2 decades that's had its ups and downs, had its problems, had its things China doesn't like, the Chinese people, government, and many others. But on balance, she's dedicated to maintaining the fabric of a constructive relationship. I believe that. And I know
where does that belief come from, Professor Lampton?
Well, first of all, she's basically been in favor of free trade. She's not like Mr. Trump saying we're going to rip up the WTO agreement. We're not going to rip up NAFTA. We're not going to call China a currency manipulator. If you look at the things Mr. Trump has said, now, of course, he's unpredictable. Maybe he won't do all these things. But Mrs. Clinton has been part of a policy-making process that, on balance, has been positive for U.S.-China relations. Now, it's true, in 2011, she, I think it's fair to say, was the co-inventor of the pivot or rebalance and so forth. On the other hand, that policy has had some problems, and I think it's in a state of evolution. And I guess what I really mean is if China's leaders adopt a positive view of working with her, I think we can probably do it. Mr. Trump is committed to policies that I think are precisely not in China's interest. Let me just give you one. He basically is threatening our allies in Korea and Japan that if they don't pay more for their military, he is going to reduce the U.S. commitment there. I know many Chinese on the one hand would say, well, what's wrong with that? But that could lead either South Korea or Japan to acquire more military force, possibly including nuclear force.
Earlier, Professor Lampton, when you were suggesting about the possible trend if Secretary Clinton being elected as the U.S. president, you were saying that the Chinese leadership, if willing to work with her, then some positive results can happen. And yet, the question from the Chinese side is whoever is going to be in the White House, whether he or she is going to willing to work with China so that for some positive results. Obviously, there are very different perspectives we're talking about here.
Well, all I would say is if you look at the rhetoric of the two candidates, who's using the threatening words and most with respect to China? I think if you just did a count of speeches with threatening words towards China, you would find a great surplus on the side of Mr. Trump.
As a sophisticated intellect as you are, Professor Lampton, do you trust in election rhetorics or do you trust people's track record? Which one is likely to provide you with more evidence about his or her policy plans once in the office?
Campaign rhetoric is one thing and governance is another, so I don't trust rhetoric too much. I tend to trust track record.
I mean, after all, she has got very different opinions among the voters as a result of her very long political career as the first wife, and then as a senator, and of course now as presidential candidate for the second time.
Right. Well, I think there's a rule in politics that, of course, when you don't know somebody very well, you often attribute the expectation that they will be better than they are. And you'll remember President Obama rose out of nowhere in the American political system and he captured the imagination of people. Mrs. Clinton has a different problem. She's been around in the American political system since at least the early 1990s, or the early 1990s. And so she's been through many scandals, many personal problems that have played out in the public sphere with her husband and other things. She tried to reform the health care system, and that didn't work so well early in her husband's administration. She had been with a law firm and involved with land deals that didn't go so well. So, you know, the American people have had 2+ decades to look at her. I think the very bright spot in the past is I think almost all Americans think she did a pretty good job as Secretary of State. I think, but after, and a pretty good job as Senator in New York. But the point is that the American people have known her a very long time, and of course she's been subject to scrutiny for a very long time.
Trust is still a big issue for her.
That's true, but remember, she's running against a real person.
Her health conditions. And nobody knows exactly all the information, neither do we know about Mr. Trump.
I would assume it's going to play a significant role. But remember, the same question was asked about Ronald Reagan because he was quite older than usual, and yet he overcame those concerns and was pretty effective till near the end of his administration.
Suffering from Alzheimer's.
But that appeared really in what you call more severe form just towards the end. But Mrs. Clinton, I think we don't know, but we don't know Mr. Trump's health. But there's more than just physical health. Right. There's what you might call, what we delicately call the temperament of personality.
Professor Lampton, let's just talk about not the two candidates specifically, but rather the election process and the election system itself. What do you make of the fairness of election with the US president? Huge amount of money behind it, a lot of campaign rhetorics not necessarily going to be translated into the eventual policies once into the office, and also using others as targets to blame, which can be widely used by politicians worldwide. But US, of course, attracted so much attention. You got the election that is likely, in a way, have a big impact for the future of the world because of US position still in today's world. So what do you make of the fairness, the nature of the US election so far, and the trend where it is going?
Well, we shouldn't romanticize past elections. Elections have generally been messy affairs in the United States.
But you know, messy is not the problem. Yeah. The problem is whether it's going to be as fair as possible and whether it is going to be choosing the best candidate for the White House.
Fair and best are themselves value statements. What's fair or best to one group is not necessarily the same to the other. And democracy or competitive elections are based on the airing of the different interests, struggle, and eventually compromise. And remember, elections are not the end of the process. We also have a Congress, we have court systems, and they struggle throughout. So I think you basically have to just simply, the Americans would say, elections aren't perfect, everything you said is true, but as Winston Churchill said, you know, the Americans explore lots of alternatives. Eventually, they get the right answer. It may be messy, it may be not a straight line, but if you don't have some way of having one group reconcile themselves to others, then you're left with other mechanisms that are not attractive.
How should people make of this political fight that is going on in your country right now, leading up to the presidential election? The rhetorics coming from both candidates, one can be very much strong, I would say, taste to the rest of the world, while the other still have a trust issue also with the rest of the world. Is the US getting the best leadership as they can, responsibly for itself and responsibly for the rest of the world?
Well, I think many Americans are asking themselves this question, and we will all have to see. I guess what I would say is I have trust in the collective wisdom of the American people, and so I think they will elect a good person in this contest. And I think we have enough constraints on our executive leader that if a mistake is made, at least we can take the rough edges off the mistake. So I think we have checks and balances, and if we were to elect somebody who was not moderate and not reasonable and didn't listen to advice, we would pay a price. The rest of the world would probably in some regards have their suffer some. But in the end, we, I think, have mechanisms in place to protect our core interests.